My name is Rick Dalton, and on Thanksgiving Day, my wife looked me straight in the eye and said, "Your father smells like an old garage. He's not coming." I set the carving knife down real slow, felt the room go quiet, and told her, "Fine, then none of you are either." That was the moment everything changed, but it had been a long time coming. I'm 52 years old. I supervise a small HVAC crew on the north side of Fort Wayne, Indiana. I've spent my life crawling through attics and basements, thawing frozen lines and coaxing old furnaces back to life when it's 10 degrees outside. It's not fancy, but it's honest, and it paid for the little ranch house I bought before I ever met my wife, Karen. Karen grew up in a different world. Her parents, Walter and Denise Hardwell, have never swung a wrench in their lives. Walter runs a financial planning office with certificates on every wall. Denise chairs church committees and talks about standards and the kind of people we associate with. They like golf cruises in neighborhoods where somebody else always does the dirty work. My dad, Jack Dalton, is the opposite of that. Dad's 74. He spent 50 years at the GM plant down in Anderson, starting on the line and ending as the man they called when a machine quit at 3 in the morning. Even retired, he's still helping out at the VFW post, still the guy widows call when their car won't start. His garage in Anderson smells like oil and cold air. Coffee cans full of bolts sit on the shelves. License plates from cars long gone hang on the wall. Over his workbench is a triangle folded American flag, the one he got when his older brother didn't come home from Vietnam. To some people, that might smell like an old garage. To me, it smells like the man who taught me to show up, work hard, and keep my word. For as long as I can remember, Thanksgiving has meant turkey and Dad. Even the years when I was broke and newly divorced, he'd show up at whatever apartment I was renting with a turkey breast and a casserole. We'd eat off mismatched plates and watch the Lions, and somehow it still felt like a real holiday. When I married Karen, I thought I was giving him something better. We had a decent kitchen, new dishes, a big table, and enough room to seat both our families. I pictured Dad carving the turkey one day while grandkids passed rolls around. It didn't work out like that. From the first Thanksgiving we hosted, I noticed little things. Denise wiping down the chair after Dad stood up. Walter joking about grease monkeys when he thought Dad couldn't hear. Karen cracking a window and saying, "That smell is giving me a headache." I told myself they didn't mean harm. I told myself Dad was tough and didn't notice. The truth is, I noticed. I just didn't want to fight. This year was supposed to be simple. My son from my first marriage couldn't make the drive, but Karen's parents were coming along with her sister and brother-in-law. I got up early, put the 22-pound bird in the oven, and watched the parade while the house filled with the warm smell of turkey butter and sage. Around noon, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and called Dad. "Hey, old man," I said. "You about ready for me to swing by and grab you?" There was a pause on the line just long enough to make my neck go tight. "Rick," he said, "I don't think I'm coming this year." I laughed automatically. "What, you finally found a better offer?" He gave a thin little chuckle. "Nothing like that. Karen called me last night. She said it was going to be a small dinner, just her folks and her sister. She said she didn't want you to feel crowded." The knife in my hand hit the cutting board harder than I meant it to. I stared at the turkey, then at the doorway to the dining room where Karen was fussing with place cards. "She said that, huh?" I managed. "Son, it's all right," Dad said quickly. "You go have your dinner. I warmed up some soup. I'll watch the game. It's no big thing." But it was a big thing. It was 50 years of busted knuckles and double shifts and rides to baseball practice being treated like a bad smell. "I'll call you back," I told him, and hung up before my voice could betray me. I walked into the dining room, phone still in my hand. Karen was lining up forks and knives like she was setting a table in a magazine spread. The good china was out the crystal her mother gave us for a wedding gift, catching the light. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice level, "why did you tell my dad it was a small dinner? Why did you tell him not to come?" She didn't look up. "Because it is a small dinner," she said. "Just family. My dad is family." Now she looked at me. Her makeup was perfect, her hair done exactly the way she knew her mother liked. She sighed like I was being difficult. "Rick, my parents are particular," she said. "They don't want to sit next to someone who smells like an old garage. I grew up with a certain standard at the table. I'm not going to have my mother uncomfortable on Thanksgiving." For a few seconds, I just stood there. I saw my dad in my mind alone in his little house in Anderson, stirring a pot of soup while the Lions played to an empty room. I set the carving knife down on the counter. Slow, deliberate. The metal made a soft clink that sounded louder than it should have. Your father smells like an old garage, she repeated almost under her breath. He's not coming. I looked at her then, at the polished table, the neat little cards with everyone's names written in her careful handwriting. Everyone's except my dad's. Fine, I said, my voice low and calm, even though my heart was pounding. Then none of you are either. She blinked. What's that supposed to mean? You'll see, I said. And that was the second my hurt turned into resolve. 10 minutes later, the whole shape of our Thanksgiving and our family started to change. When I walked out of that dining room, I didn't slam a door. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything or make some dramatic exit the way people do in movies. That's not who I am, and it's not how I was raised. I went to the garage. It was cold in there the way Indiana garages always are in late November, smelling of concrete cardboard boxes and the faint metallic tang of tools. My workbench light flickered on, casting a soft glow across the space. On the pegboard above the bench hung a framed photo, me at 16, standing next to my first truck, a beat-up '84 Chevy S10. Dad had bought it from a retired colleague for $300. The thing barely ran, smoked like a chimney, and leaked oil anywhere it sat for 5 minutes. But Dad showed up every evening for 3 months straight, helping me pull the engine, replace the hoses, scrub the valves, and rebuild it piece by piece. I remember asking him once why he bothered. He looked at me with those patient blue eyes of his and said, "Because you're my son, and a son ought to know what it feels like to build something that lasts." That truck lasted 13 years. Thinking about that memory in that cold garage with the house full of standards and expectations behind me, something hardened inside me. Not anger, not revenge, not yet. Just a firm, quiet understanding that some lines once crossed don't uncross. I pulled out my phone and called Dad again. He answered on the first ring. "Hey, son." I could hear something in his voice, an attempt to sound cheerful, steady. My chest tightened. "Dad," I said softly, "did Karen really say that to you, about it being a small dinner?" He hesitated. That was all the answer I needed. "She didn't want you feeling out of place," he said carefully. "Said her parents had certain tastes. I didn't want to cause trouble." "You never caused trouble," I said. I leaned on the workbench, head down. "You're the easiest man in the world to feed a meal to." He gave a quiet laugh, the kind that was meant to lighten things but didn't land right. "Rick, it's okay. I warmed up some chicken noodle." "I'm all right. You go enjoy yourself." There it was again, that automatic selflessness, that old Midwestern humility. But behind it, I heard something he didn't intend to show: loneliness and disappointment. A man can be tough his whole life and still feel a cut when it comes from his own family. "No," I said, "not this time." There was a pause, and then Rick, "Don't do anything foolish." I looked around the garage at the tools he'd given me one by one over the years, at the photo of my first truck, at the faint oil stain on the concrete floor from when he'd changed my brakes a few months ago. "Dad," I said quietly, "I'm not doing anything foolish. I'm finally doing something right." I hung up before he could argue. Inside the house, I could hear laughter, Karen's sister Melissa and her husband arriving early. I pictured them walking in, taking off their coats, Karen greeting them with a bright smile while acting like everything was perfectly normal. I stepped out of the garage and walked around to the driveway, shoving my hands into my jacket pockets. The Hardwell's Audi sat there gleaming, washed and waxed, the type of car that always smelled like expensive leather and never saw a speck of dust. Walter had probably polished it that morning. Something about that car bothered me, not the car itself, but what it represented. Everything had to look right with them. Appear respectable, appear elevated, appear superior. Appear. Meanwhile, my father's only crime was being something real. I stood there a long moment in the cold, watching my breath fog the air. That's when the first stirrings of a plan formed in my mind. Not the whole picture, not yet, but the outline of one. A plan built on something Dad taught me when I was 12, and we'd rebuilt a mower engine together. He'd said, "Son, if something's not working right, take the whole thing apart. Figure out what you can save. Toss what you can't, and build it back better." This family situation wasn't working right, and it was time to take the whole thing apart. I went back inside. Melissa was pouring wine. Walter and Denise were admiring the table. Karen was checking the timer on the oven, looking pleased with herself. She glanced at me but didn't seem to notice my expression. "Turkey's almost done," she said cheerfully. "Dad and Mom want to take some pictures at the table before we eat." I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "Pictures, sure." She smiled like the issue was settled. It wasn't. 10 minutes later, I had the dining room door closed, the carving knife set aside, and a plan crystallizing in my mind. A plan that would change Thanksgiving. A plan that would make things right, not through shouting, not through fighting, but through something stronger. Truth shown publicly in a way no one could ignore. A plan worthy of the man who taught me what real class looks like. I didn't go back to the dining room. Instead, I stepped quietly into the kitchen, grabbed an oven mitt, and opened the oven door. The turkey was golden, the skin crisping, just right. The smell of butter, thyme, and sage rose into the warm air. Karen had done a good job, no denying that. But it wasn't going to be eaten in this house. Not by these people. I stood there for a moment, letting the heat from the oven wash over me. Then I shut it gently, slipped on the mitts, and started pulling the dishes off the counter. Green bean casserole, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, a pan of stuffing, still warm from the stove. One by one, I loaded them into foil trays and covered them as neatly as I could. The kitchen was filled with voices from the other room. Karen laughing, someone uncorking wine, Walter asking where the real crystal was. And then Melissa said, "Did Rick ever pick up his dad? I didn't see his truck." Karen answered casually, "No. I told him not to bother. We're keeping it small this year." There was a round of soft approval sounds, like they all agreed. That was the spark. The moment the plan fully ignited. These people weren't just excluding my father, they were proud of it. I moved quietly. I grabbed my keys from the hook, slipped out the back door into the cold afternoon, and walked straight toward my truck. The sun was low, that pale November gold you only get in the Midwest, throwing long shadows across the frost-covered grass. I opened the tailgate and began loading in the food. The aluminum trays clattered softly. My breath puffed in little clouds as I worked. When the turkey came out last, I set it in the truck bed like it was a sacred object. Maybe it was. In a way, this wasn't just dinner. It was the center of a whole different kind of Thanksgiving, one my father actually deserved. As I slid the last tray into the back seat, my phone buzzed. A text from Karen. "Where are you?" Then another, "Rick." I ignored them. Instead, I drove. The streets were empty, quiet. Just bare trees, the distant smell of wood stoves, and houses with plastic turkeys stuck in the lawns. I passed the old fire station, then the mire, then the turnoff for Route 3. 5 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of St. Anne's Church Hall. Dad volunteered there for years. Fish fry nights, pancake breakfasts, car repair days for widows. The place always had a warm, honest feeling to it. It was the opposite of the Hardwell's version of class. Inside the hall, lights were already on. A couple of volunteers folks from the church and a few vets from the VFW were setting up folding tables for a community meal later that evening. The second I walked in with foil trays stacked in my arms, Pastor Miller looked up. "Rick, everything all right?" I nodded. "Better than all right. I need a favor." He didn't ask for details, not yet. That's the kind of trust you get in a community where people actually know you. Two vets, Carl and Benny, came over to help without hesitation. They'd known my dad since the factory days. Carl slapped the side of my truck, laughing. "Man, this smells better than the stuff we usually get." "Yeah," I said. "It's all going to the dinner here, every last bit." They grinned. Carl clapped me on the shoulder. Benny went back inside, calling for more volunteers to help unload. As they carried food into the hall, I took a minute to breathe. The hall was decorated with simple paper turkeys made by the Sunday school kids. The American flag hung in the corner, a folded triangle sitting in a shadow box below it. The same kind my dad kept in his garage. It felt right. It felt like home. Once we had the tables covered and the scent of warm food spread through the hall, Carl looked at me and asked, "So what's the other part of the plan?" I smiled. "I've got one more stop to make." I got back into my truck, drove the 20 minutes down to Anderson, and pulled into my dad's driveway. His porch light was on. Through the window, I could see him sitting in his recliner, bowl of soup untouched in his lap, Lions game playing quietly on the old TV. When I knocked, he opened the door, surprised. "Rick, everything, okay?" "Yeah, Dad," I said. "Come on, grab your coat." He frowned. "What for?" I grinned. Thanksgiving moved. He stared at me for a moment, then chuckled in that slow way of his. "You're up to something." "Maybe," I said. "You'll see." He grabbed his old jacket, the one with the GM logo embroidered on the sleeve, and followed me out to the truck. His joints were stiff, but he moved with that same quiet dignity he always had. As we drove back toward Fort Wayne, he said, "You didn't do anything foolish, did you?" "Nothing illegal," I said. He snorted. "That's not the same thing." When the hall came into view, lit up and full of people moving around inside, he tilted his head. "What's all this?" I parked, walked around to his door, and helped him out. "Dad," I said, "you're spending Thanksgiving with people who actually respect you." He looked at me with a mixture of confusion, amusement, and something else, something softer. Inside the hall, the moment he walked through the doors, voices lifted. "Jack, hey buddy." There he is, happy. "Thanksgiving, man." Folks clapped him on the back. A widow he'd helped with her alternator last winter hugged him and said couldn't have Thanksgiving without the best mechanic in the county. Dad looked overwhelmed, in a good way. A real way. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed nonstop in my pocket. Karen's calls, texts, little gray bubbles of frustration and confusion. But Thanksgiving wasn't happening at my house anymore. Not until the truth had its place at the table. Back at the house, Karen and her family had finally realized something was wrong. While Dad and I were sharing plates in the church hall, him laughing with Carl, me helping pour coffee for the widows, Karen was pacing our empty kitchen, calling me over and over. I didn't answer a single one. She must have thought I'd stepped outside or maybe stormed off after an argument. But when she opened the oven and saw nothing inside, when she checked the counters and saw empty spaces where the dishes had been, and when she threw open the fridge and found only a single folded note stuck to the door with a magnet, Thanksgiving moved. Well, that's when panic really started to bloom. I wasn't there to see it, but I imagined it clearly. Walter stammering, Denise clutching her pearls like the world had ended, Melissa whispering, "What does that even mean?" as if they just discovered a ransom note. They must have piled into their cars in a flurry of outrage and confusion, following the location I'd finally texted Karen 10 minutes earlier. St. Anne's Church Hall, if you want dinner, come here. And they did. Oh, they did. Dad and I were standing near the long buffet table when the auditorium doors banged open. Karen swept inside, first her hair slightly frazzled from the wind, her heels clacking loud against the tile. Her parents followed Walter, red-faced and breathing hard, Denise tight-lipped and horrified as she took in the folding tables and paper decorations. Melissa and her husband trailed behind, confused and embarrassed. But here's the thing. Nobody in the hall paid them any special attention. They weren't royalty here. They weren't the important ones. They were just people who walked into a room full of folks who actually knew the meaning of community. Karen stormed toward me. "Rick, what is this?" she hissed. "Where is the dinner? Why did you bring it here?" I kept my voice level. "Because this is where Thanksgiving belongs today." She stared at me like I was speaking another language. "With strangers." Before I could answer, one of the veterans, Benny, with his old Navy cap on, walked over. He nodded at Dad, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am," he said, polite but firm, "your husband's father is the kind of man this country used to be built on." The room went quiet. A few heads nodded. A couple of widows murmured in agreement. Karen blinked. She wasn't expecting public judgment, not here, not from people she didn't think mattered. And in that moment, something cracked in her expression. Not anger, not indignation. Shame, deep, sudden, unvarnished shame. She noticed how people treated Dad with genuine affection, respect earned through decades of sweat and kindness. She saw how he belonged here in a way she never had at her parents' country club dinners. She looked small, and she knew it. Then came the third strike, the one that landed the hardest. I took out my phone, tapped the screen, and held it up so every single person near us could hear. It was a Facebook post from Maple Street Shelter, made just 20 minutes earlier. A heartfelt thank you to Karen Hardwell and Denise Hardwell for donating a full Thanksgiving meal to local families in need today. Your generosity reminds us what this holiday is all about. Karen's face drained of color. Denise gasped. Walter made a choking sound. And I added calm as a man reading the weather. "Oh, and I tagged both of you. Figured you'd want the recognition." The hall erupted not with mockery, but with that warm, knowing laughter that comes when poetic justice lands just right. A couple of people even clapped. But the Hardwells. They stood frozen, caught between anger and horror, utterly powerless to spin this into something flattering. Dad grabbed my arm, his grip trembling. I looked down and saw tears pooling in his eyes. Son, he whispered, voice cracking, 50 years I fixed everybody else's problems. Nobody ever fixed mine. I swallowed hard. Today I did, Dad, I said quietly. He pulled me in forehead against mine for a moment, just breathing. That alone was worth every ounce of planning. The Hardwells turned to leave thoroughly humiliated. Karen followed them halfway before stopping. She looked back at me, then at Dad. Something inside her was breaking and rebuilding at the same time. But the room had already moved on. People lined up for food. Carl carved the turkey. Kids from the church poured lemonade. Dad was pulled into another conversation before he could catch his breath. I stepped forward and raised my voice just a little. There's plenty of food left, folks. Funny how a 22-pound turkey feeds a whole lot more people when the wrong ones aren't here. Laughter rolled through the hall like a wave, warm, good-natured, exactly the kind of sound Dad had earned all his life. And for the first time all day, I finally felt the knot in my chest start to loosen. Karen didn't follow her parents out of the hall right away. She hovered in the doorway for a long moment, torn between two worlds, the polished, judgmental one she came from and the warm, genuine one right in front of her. Her eyes kept drifting back to Dad. He was standing near the dessert table, telling an old story to a small crowd. Carl was laughing so hard he nearly doubled over. One of the widows squeezed Dad's arm affectionately. A couple of teenagers from the church youth group asked him questions about his GM days. Karen watched it all with a strange, almost stunned expression. Then she looked at me. Not angry, not defensive, just unsettled. Like something inside her had suddenly been rearranged and she was seeing the world through new glass. She walked slowly toward me. Rick, she said softly, I didn't know. I folded my arms. Didn't know what? That he meant that much to all these people, she whispered. That he mattered like this. I didn't sugarcoat anything. He always mattered, Karen. You just never looked. She flinched, not dramatically, just a small, honest wince. The kind that comes from hearing the truth without any dressing on it. I'm sorry, she said, the first real apology I'd heard from her in months. I shouldn't have treated him like that. I shouldn't have treated you like that. I nodded once. Nothing more. Forgiveness is a long road, not a switch you flip. She wiped her eyes and looked around the hall again. I could see the realization settle heavier and heavier on her shoulders, that the people she tried so hard to impress couldn't hold a candle to the man she tried to shut out. Walter and Denise were already in their car by then, probably rehearsing excuses they'd tell their friends later. Karen watched their taillights disappear through the frosted windows of the hall. But she didn't go with them. Instead, she stayed. She sat down at a folding table, took a plate someone handed her, and quietly joined the meal. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Just being there, really being there, was the beginning of something new. Dad and I sat together a little later, our plates cleaned the hall, filled with soft chatter and clinking silverware. He leaned back in his chair and sighed, that content kind of sigh a man only makes when he feels seen and valued. This, he said, gesturing around the room, is the best Thanksgiving I've had in years. I smiled. You deserved one, Dad. He looked at me for a long second. I know you did all this for me, but you also did it for yourself. How do you figure? You remembered who you are, he said simply, and who you come from. That's worth more than any fancy dish or table setting. I didn't argue. He was right. The next week, Karen and I sat down and talked, really talked, without pretense or defensiveness. She admitted she'd let her parents shape too much of her identity. She'd gotten caught up in image and status, trying to be someone she wasn't raised to be. We agreed to counseling, not because the marriage was broken beyond repair, but because it was worth rebuilding properly, this time with honesty and boundaries. As for the Hardwells, well, they stayed quiet. Sometimes silence says everything. Dad came over for dinner the Sunday after Thanksgiving. Karen cooked nothing fancy, just roast chicken and potatoes, and she actually sat and talked with him. She listened. She asked him questions. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for Dad, that was more than enough. A year later, we hosted Thanksgiving again, but not at our house. We held it back at St. Anne's Church Hall with the same folding tables, the same paper decorations, the same folks who made last year so special. Karen helped prepare side dishes. Dad carved the turkey. Pastor Miller said grace. And when the last of the pecan pie disappeared and people started gathering coats and leftovers, I stood for a moment, just taking it all in the hall full of real community, real gratitude, real respect. Respect that had nothing to do with polished silver or spotless tablecloths. Respect that came from character and kindness, not cosmetics. And I realized something then. We don't always get to choose who sits at our table, but we do get to choose what kind of table we set. Before I wrap this up, let me leave you with the same simple truth I ended that night with. Real class isn't about the car you drive or the china on the table. It's about who you let sit at it. Next year, we're doing Thanksgiving the same way, same hall, same people, and the door's still open for anyone who knows what respect really means. If you're over 50 and this story hit home, if you've ever stood up for someone who deserved better or wished somebody had stood up for you, go ahead and subscribe. Share your own story in the comments. I read every single one, and trust me, your stories are next.